Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Biology with Mrs. Evans. We left off in the last video talking about the water molecule and what makes it kind of interesting, and the fact that it is a polar molecule. Remember, polar means that it has uneven distribution of charge. So the hydrogen, remember, is positively charged, and the oxygen is negatively charged. So a lot of the properties that we see in water are unique, and they are mostly because of the hydrogen bonds that we find in water. So I've listed here the important properties of water that you need to know, and I'm going to discuss each of these in detail in a moment. So if you want to take a moment, pause the video, jot down these important qualities, and then I'm going to discuss them further in detail. Alright, so important property number one. Water is known as the universal solvent. And what that means is that water can dissolve lots of substances. And the reason why it can do that, again, is because water is polar. So, salt water, okay, it is basically a solution. I'm going to talk about what solutions are in a minute because it's related to this. But remember, the hydrogen of the water molecule is positive and the oxygen is negatively charged. So water can dissolve basically the salt, because salt, remember, is formed from an ionic bond. Sodium is going to become positively charged and chlorine is going to become negatively charged. So what happens is the water molecules basically surround the ions, and it can pull them apart. Notice in the picture that you have here, the hydrogens, which again, remember, positively charged, are attracted to the negative, which would be chlorine here, and then oxygen is going to be attracted to the positive, which would be sodium, and it's going to pull those apart. So water is known as the universal solvent, and something that you might want to jot down is just to remember that a saying called like dissolves like. So what that means is that water is going to dissolve other polar substances, because again, the hydrogen and oxygen can be attracted to the different charges on the different ions, or the different molecules that are polar. You'll notice, if you've ever seen Italian salad dressing, there's separation there. That is because water is polar and oil is nonpolar, so water will not dissolve a nonpolar substance. So just know, because of its polarity, it can dissolve lots of substances, and that's important for us because the food that we eat is going to be able to dissolve that, and then also not only dissolve it, but also transport those nutrients to us. So that brings us to the second important property of water, is the ability to transport those substances. So properties of water, again, you heard me talk about a solution, and you need to know what a mixture is. A mixture basically is composed of two or more elements or compounds that are physically mixed together but not chemically bonded. So you can physically separate them. So salt and pepper would be an example of a mixture, and salt water is also an example of a mixture. And you can separate the salt from the water by boiling it. Water would evaporate out, and then salt would be left behind. So that brings us to, there are two types of mixtures. One is, you heard me mention a second ago, is a solution. And solutions, you need to know, are mixtures where everything basically is uniform throughout. If you look at a glass of salt water, you really can't see any distinction between the salt and the water. Whereas a suspension, right, it is a type of mixture where it is not uniform throughout. There are parts of undissolved material that is floating. So again, I mentioned the salad dressing. Salad dressing would be another example of a suspension. All right, so that brings us to solution. Again, solution is a type of mixture where everything is evenly distributed throughout. So salt water would be an example of a solution. And then there's some terms that you need to know with that, and solute is one of those. A solute is the object being dissolved. So in the example of the salt water, salt would be the solute, and the solvent is the object doing the dissolving, so water would be the solvent. So you need to know solute what's being dissolved, and solvent, what is doing the dissolving. And then again, suspensions, remember, is a mixture in which some materials are not evenly distributed, and you see undissolved particles. An example of that, you saw the dirty water, and then also in your body would be the blood that is coursing through your veins and arteries. It is a suspension, because if you look at the parts of blood, you have red blood cells, white blood cells, all suspended in plasma, which is the liquid portion of your blood, and then also these little platelets that are used for clotting factors and things like that. So a suspension, all right, is not evenly distributed. And again, example would be your blood, salad dressing, things like that. All right, so again, the second part about water is it's important to us is its ability to transport substances. That is why pretty much most of your body is water. All right, so water is going to dissolve the foods that we eat, or help dissolve the foods that we eat, and then it's going to transport those nutrients through our bodies. And also, if you notice here, plants, they have vascular tissue that's going to transport those materials. And again, water is the medium that allows for the transporting of those substances. High heat capacity. What that means is that it takes a lot of energy to raise the temperature of water. So water tends to be stable. So in earth science, you talked about sea breezes and land breezes, because land, remember, heats up pretty quickly and also cools pretty rapidly, but water tends to stay relatively stable. So why is that important? It's important because it helps us regulate our body temperature. It helps the organisms that live in that type of environment, so they're not getting cooked. All right, so water is, has a high heat capacity, so it's resistant into pretty extreme changes in temperature. And along with that, it also takes a lot of energy to, or a lot of time to basically lose that energy from being heated up. So high heat capacity, or high specific heat, you'll hear it referred to, just that water is resistant basically to changes in temperature, which is good for us because, again, remember homeostasis, it helps us maintain our body temperature. Another thing that is unique to water is that water expands when it's frozen. All right, most substances, when they are solid, they are more dense than the liquid form of that substance. This is not the case with water. The solid version of water is less dense, so it floats. And this is important for organisms that live in water environments, because the ice is going to act like a blanket. And the reason why the solid version of water is less dense is because of the hydrogen bonds. If you look at the two pictures here, the one here on the right, this is your ice. This is your solid version of water, and the hydrogen bonds basically cause the crystals to form at fixed positions, creating these spaces here. And a lot of times, if you look at a ice cube, you'll see also those little air pockets, again helping it become less dense, so it floats, and it keeps those organisms that live in water nice and toasty, because the ice that's floating is going to act like a blanket. And obviously, if you've watched the Alaskan truckers, they take advantage of water's property, because basically the water is going to freeze from the top down instead of from the bottom up, and sometimes, as you see in the picture, they miscalculate and they end up in the drink. So water is both cohesive and adhesive. So what does that mean? In other words, just think of water as being sticky. It likes to stick to itself, and it also likes to stick to other substances. So cohesion, co means together. So two water molecules are going to stick to one another. And then adhesion is the attraction between different molecules. And the way that I remember it is just remember the D for different. So adhesion is going to stick to different molecules. And if you've ever gone outside after it rains, You've probably seen something that looks like this. So water is sticking to the blades of grass, sticking to the spider web here. Those are examples of adhesion. And then cohesion, water molecules sticking to each other. And that's what allows water to basically move up all of our blood vessels, and also for water to go from the roots of a plant all the way up to the tippy top. And that process that you need to know is called capillary action. Capillary action is the movement of water basically through small tubules, and that's what, again, what allows water to course, or our blood to course through our veins, and water to go from the roots to the top of even the world's tallest trees. All right, so capillary action is, again, caused from both cohesion and adhesion. Water sticking basically to the sides of our arteries and veins, and also pulling water behind it. All right, one molecule is attracted to the water molecule behind it and help pulling the water or the blood through our veins. Adhesion is also responsible for, if you look at a graduated cylinder and you see that curvature, remember curvature on the graduated cylinder is called a meniscus, and water is attracted obviously to the sides, and it basically is starting to climb up the sides of the graduated cylinder, and that's why you see that is because of water's adhesive properties. So not only are we made up of water, or mainly made up of water, but water also has what we call heat of vaporization, which allows basically for cooling for us. So remember, homeostasis helps us maintain an internal environment no matter what's going on around us. And again, water is going to play a vital role, partly because we are made up of water, so we're going to be resistant to huge fluctuation in body temperature. But also, if we do get heated, we are going to sweat, and the removal of basically, evaporation of water from our skin is going to cool us, because basically when water evaporates, it's going to take that heat with it. So we get cooler, and again, helps us maintain homeostasis. So we have sweat glands which allow us to maintain homeostasis. However, our dog friends do not have sweat glands, so in order for them to help regulate their body temperature, they are going to pant. So when the basically the saliva evaporates off of their tongue, it cools them. Plants, they don't have sweat glands and they don't have tongues, so how can they maintain a specific temperature? They do that by transpiration, and you just simply need to know right now, transpiration is basically the loss of water from plant leaves, and again, by that water evaporating, they're going to be cool. So water helps us maintain homeostasis, one, by being resistant to huge changes in temperature because of its high specific heat, and also helps cool us because of its heat of vaporization. So when water evaporates, it's going to take heat with it, thereby cooling us once it evaporates.